David, I think minds will be blown today. We've got an amazing show for our Patreon and Subscribe Star sponsors. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, Jason, and it's good to be with you.
Yes, it's good to be with you, David. I look forward to our shows each Friday. And, there's been a bit of a change with Patreon here now that it's July 2nd, or sorry, July 3rd. The change occurred on July 1st. There's a new law pertaining to collecting taxes for goods purchased over the internet. I don't know if this pertains to Canada, but certainly in the United States, the IRS is not satisfied with all the money that we're all paying as it is. So now they want to tax our sponsors. What do you think about this, David?
Well, it's a clear demonstration of the weaponization of the tax department, and not just in the United States. It's Canada Revenue Agency and Her Majesty's Revenues and Customs in the United Kingdom. And one of the people we're going to be talking about today, of course, is this man, Oliver Buck-Revel, who I think is operating a very extraordinarily interesting protection racket. Now, just to remind the audience, Oliver Buck-Revel did work at the FBI at the highest level. He walked onto the tarmac when Pan Am 103 was about to take off to be blown up over Lockerbie, and took his son and daughter-in-law off the tarmac. Well, for me, and I think for most people, that's a clear example of foreknowledge. And it gets deeper than that, because even back then, and that was 1988, he would have had access to the kinds of technology necessary for what we've talked about extensively over the fast shows, to launch a double cross attack on the air traffic control systems above the United Kingdom into Scotland, and actually allow someone to hack into the electronics or the avionics of that plane and trigger a bomb. So this is an extraordinarily dangerous man, in my opinion, or an extraordinarily negligent one, because with these systems, you never know whether they're just created a backdoor or the opportunity for a man in the middle attack because they're incompetent, or with malice aforethought. So this is a guy that is really worth studying, particularly as, having left the FBI in 1994, he sets up a company in Vancouver, which is in my backyard, very close to the areas that we visited of the downtown east side, for the application of face recognition software in order to track people through, let's say, for example, welfare agencies. All right. So he is able to record the images, or he, the company, or the people who are sponsoring that company, are able to record the faces of people who apply for welfare. Now, as you know, we faced in BC, and I attribute a lot of this to either negligence or malice aforethought to people like Oliver Buck-Revel, the most extraordinary series of murders of women in the downtown east side, many of whom were First Nations, as we call them up here, who had applied to the welfare agents for support with their children. Now, of course, it's very interesting to track these people, but what happens if that turned into a scouting operation to identify those women and their children who could be taken off the streets and disappeared, perhaps in the most brutal form of murder, or an audience actually watching these people being murdered, either in the studio down below 425 Carroll Street, Starnet Communications, or out at the so-called Picton Pig Farm, where it's not at all obvious they were killed at the Hells Angels clubhouse on Burns Road. And we drove past that, but we didn't actually visit the clubhouse. And the area where the barn was set up, where the media has told us that's where the big ceremony were held. So I think Oliver Buck-Revel is going to lead us to the crown jewels of a criminal organization that spans 5 continents. And its modern form, or its most modern form, is what was known as Phantom Secure out of Richmond, British Columbia, which is about a 15 minutes drive from Vancouver. But I believe we'll be able to show in this part of the show that Phantom Secure grew out of, with advanced technology using Blackberries, out of the Weather Underground organization. So here we have, on your collage, if you will, at the opening, we have these two images, two people that are absolutely core to what I believe is a conspiracy that started back in the 60s and extends through to the present day. I don't quite know how to pronounce this guy's name. Is it Kema Buddha? Do you know how to pronounce
I think it's Chesa Boudin. This is the guy who was recently elected district attorney of San Francisco. And one of the most notable things about it, David, is that while people generally have a tendency to follow presidential politics and of all the people who vote at all, most people are voting for president, but I don't think that people really get that involved in a wide scale in local politics, particularly not with the district attorney. So, relatively small amounts of money can be utilized to fill these positions in various cities. And perhaps, before we know it, we might find ourselves in a situation where a lot of these people are in place in fairly powerful positions, and they might not have our best interests in mind.
No, they don't. And I believe you are looking now at the United States as you were back in 1968 in the days of rage. You're looking at an insurrection, a global insurrection, right? A global insurrection. That is an attempt to overthrow the governments, not just sovereign governments around the world, but in particular, the governments of the Five Eyes countries that pioneered, if you will, signals intelligence in the Five Eyes during World War II that was necessary as a technology to operate these so-called double cross operations, such as, now this is a theory and we can explore that, it'll probably require another show, such as Pearl Harbor. I believe Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, was actually orchestrated through a double-cross operation run out of the United Kingdom in order to get the United States in the war.
Well, so let me pause you for a second, David, because we've always got a lot of new viewers with us each time. I want to make sure that people understand what this double-cross system is, where it originates, and what we mean when we're talking about it here. Give us a little overview of that again, if you can.
Well, let me give you an example of a superb double-cross operation that was known as Operation Mincemeat. And what the British did is that, the objective of the British and the Allies, it was really towards the closing stages of the war, they wanted to deceive the Germans into thinking that the invasion in the southern Mediterranean, the underbelly of Europe, as Churchill would call it, was going to take place in Greece and not Sicily. So they found a guy who had actually committed suicide by eating rat poison. He was known, or became known, as Major Martin, right? He was a Marine captain, and they packed him in dry ice because his body, needed to be preserved until they were ready to launch the operation. They got him a uniform and some false papers, including a picture of a girlfriend, etc., etc. And on his body, attached, I believe, with a chain to a valise or briefcase, inside the briefcase was a letter from Lord Mountbatten to the commander in the southern Mediterranean, indicating that the invasion of the underbelly of Europe would be in Greece. The objective was to deceive the Germans into moving, as they did, 3 divisions, I believe that's 30,000 men, to Greece, and they kept them there even when the invasion of Sicily started, because by then the double-cross agents in Germany had convinced the German high command and Hitler that that would be a feint. So the feint would be in Sicily, when in fact it was a real one. The next operation, which is spectacular, is for the D-Day landings. The Allies, that is the British and the Americans, I think the Five Eyes members joined after the war, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. But the Allies, and that would be an office in which a guy called Elmer Davis would play a key role. And Elmer Davis was a Rhodes Scholar in 1910, and he was in charge of, I think it was, is it the War Information Office?
Yeah, and actually what we've got happening right now, David, is that people in our comments are telling us things like John Brennan is a communist. That's true. He voted communist. He admitted to that. I think he might have even been a member of the American Communist Party. We've done extensive interviews with Diana West, author of the book The Red Thread, An American Betrayal. And Diana is so well researched and so well informed on this topic. She's revealed a lot. And, this is the same kind of thing that was being talked about with McCarthy, talking about communists. Now, he was painted as a guy who was sort of exaggerating the problem and sort of, overreacting, but it seems now that that was not the case. So Elmer Davis, he was running this information office where actually Mayor de Blasio's mother, Maria de Blasio, worked. And the thing that's interesting is they don't have the same last name through the traditional sense where, and particularly at that time, most women took the last name of their husband. We weren't really seeing as much, today it's not that uncommon for a woman, particularly in the professional world, to keep her last name. But this seems to be particularly strategic in that Bill de Blasio's real name is Warren Wilhelm Jr. And the Wilhelm family has a long history in communism. What do we know about this guy, Elmer Davis, and the Office of War Information?
Well, he was a Rhodes Scholar in 1910, and our regular listeners will know that we've identified the Rhodes Scholarship Network as a potential recruiting network by N.M. Rothschild, which administers the fund, for double agents to be planted in countries, even ostensibly Allied countries, after the war. Just to remind people that every German agent in the United Kingdom by the end of the war had either been executed or turned into a double agent. That is to say, they were feeding disinformation back to the German High Command, which, for example, had the German High Command move 3 divisions, that's 30,000 men, from Sicily to Greece, which would have saved a lot of lives, because if they'd stayed in Sicily, they would have killed, obviously, and vice versa. The even bigger one is Operation Bodyguard, because Operation Bodyguard actually kept 25 divisions in the Pas-de-Calais area, while the invasions of D-Day were in Normandy. Right? So I think you just showed a picture of an inflatable tank, which I love. I think you said that you would like one of those. Right?
I looked it up online. It's like $5,000 for an inflatable tank. But actually,
Right.
I'm sorry to diverge, but something's just come to my attention, David. We've looked at this Rhodes house in London before, and it's like a fancy mansion. But what is this? This looks like a kind of a low-income apartment building. That's the Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes house.
Yeah, that I don't know, but I know the one with the dome is got the name Rhodes Home or Rhodes House in Oxford. But just to carry on,
Look at this, David. Something is blurred on it. They don't want us to see it.
maybe it's one of those sculptures with a naked boy, right? But
It's
anyway,
quite weird.
yes, yes. Well, perhaps we can find that out later. But going back to Operation Bodyguard, so the Germans started to move some of those divisions towards Normandy. The double cross operation cut in, and they were reminded, or actually told, as I understand it, that what was going on in Normandy was a feint. So Hitler and his senior commanders actually returned all the divisions to the area around the Pas-de-Calais, and they stayed there all the way through during the attacks in Normandy. And that basically established a beachhead for the D-Day landing. So my thesis is that the Rhodes Scholarship operation, funded from the estate of Cecil Rhodes through N.M. Rothschild and Sons, is actually the driver of the modern double cross operations, which would include the bomb on Pan Am 103, right? The attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, the attack on the East African embassies and the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, 95, 98, the attack on the USS Cole in Aden Harbor of 2000, and the 9/11 attacks, which were ridiculously attributed to what I call a long-bearded guy straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan. And Americans need to, put it bluntly, you need to wake up, because from a military strategy point of view, it is impossible for a guy in a cave in Afghanistan, or possibly on a dialysis machine at the hospital in Dubai being visited by the CIA, to stage attack that brought the world's most powerful country to its knees. And had that fourth plane left on time, 41 minutes late it would have taken out the Capitol building at the same time as the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center, and America would have been decapitated. And that's what you're dealing. The complete failure of the intelligence agencies to investigate the 9/11 attack and identify who was behind it. And my thesis, or our thesis, I think, is it was actually a manifestation of the Weather Underground organization, which was committed to the destruction or the overthrow by force of the United States Republic. It's morphed in with modern technology, aided and abetted by this guy, Oliver Buck-Revel, into a system of, and I think I just mentioned before the show, I've got a nice acronym for our listeners to consider, which is a bid-map tax system.
What does that mean?
Okay, so B stands for, well, basically this is a protection racket operated by the inheritors of the Weather Underground organization, the legatees, if you will, and the Rhodes network. B stands for pay your taxes or you're going to be bombed. Pay your taxes or you're going to be infected, right? By infected, I mean infected by a virus such as COVID-19, which I don't know if that's the right word from a microbiologist's point of view. It was bred through a Rhodes scholar by the name of Bill Clinton and his dirty, tainted prison blood program, right? Where they were collecting tainted blood from prisoners in the Arkansas correction system at $7 a pint, paid in script. I mean, these guys are cheap scumbags, exporting it up to Montreal at $50 a pint, moving it over to Connaught Laboratories in the University of Toronto, where it would be fractionated, but it wasn't cleansed or bleached, and Lord knows how you do that, of all the viruses that were associated with the sexual practices of prisoners in the Arkansas prison system.
Well, not only that, David, it makes zero sense to collect blood from prisoners unless you specifically want unhealthy blood. I don't know that prison is the first place I would go if I needed blood for myself. Maybe a health club or some kind of like just, regular sample of the population. I think it's widely known that there's a lot of drug use in prison, a lot of intravenous drug use, a lot of illicit and potentially unwanted sex. All these things are high risk for the spread of bloodborne viruses. So you've detailed in past shows how Bill and Hillary Clinton have basically a lot of experience in weaponizing these types of viruses through this Connaught Laboratories disaster, the scandal. There were basically a large number of hemophiliacs and other patients requiring blood transfusions in Canada who got hepatitis C and HIV from this distribution of blood. So this notion that a virus would be weaponized is not new. We've spoken a lot about a potential role of this network of double-cross agents and what they might have done in their parts of this coronavirus outbreak. But it's strange. There's so many things that are named after Cecil Rhodes, and I'm not easily able to find that very distinctive mansion that we've seen before. David, this entire mountain is the Cecil Rhodes Mountain. What is that about?
Well, I'm not sure where that is, but
it's Alaska or something.
Yeah. Well, no, he was a very powerful guy. He left a great deal of money. His original plan, which I think is now being executed before our very eyes, is to have a 200-year strategy where the world will be controlled through the Anglo-Saxon race with a few bones thrown to the Germans, right? And when Black Lives Matter, when it launches its campaign, let me just remind the effect of the tainted blood racket operated by Bill Clinton and his crony wife through Canada at Connaught Laboratories. That blood was then turned into a plasma and shipped off into Africa. And basically, I believe it was a weaponized infection viral system that was intended to cull populations in Southern Africa or Angola through AIDS and, I don't know, Ebola, Hep C. It's just a most disgusting manifestation of negligent homicide, right? And the left loves Bill Clinton. I can't understand why. This scumbag was actually expelled from Oxford for rape and drug dealing. He goes to Moscow. He comes back, gets his law degree from Yale, and then he slithers down into Arkansas with his crony wife, and he lectures at the University of Arkansas on constitutional law, and she lectures on criminal law, giving them a perfect, basically, platform to launch what I think is these Rhodes Scholar attacks through double cross operations in the United States. I believe that Bill Clinton, was a double agent and became very rapidly a double agent handler, right? Or double cross handler. And I make a major distinction between handlers and agents. So I believe Oliver Buck Revell is a double cross agent, right? And his handlers would be people who have Rhodes scholarships that entered or took some disgusting ceremony, probably involving children, underage children being abused, right? They're photographed, they're filmed. The facial recognition software put together by Oliver Buck Revell in his offices or operations on Georgia Street in Vancouver, that kicked off, I believe, in 1998, right? When there were two things going on contemporaneously in southern BC. One is the StarNet communications operation.
Right. And that's, sorry to interrupt, David, but that's what I wanted to bring to your attention. I've just noticed in this CBC article about the 400 Canadian hemophiliacs who intend to sue the Food and Drug Administration. This was in February of 1999. It appears that the raid on StarNet Communications happened later that year. Is there any connection there, David? I mean, I can't help but consider the analog between Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and their sexual entrapment network, and what very well may have been going on at StarNet Communications in terms of sexual entrapment, and how the raids on these things seem to happen at the same time. There's a lot of people who doubt that despite Ghislaine Maxwell's apprehension yesterday, many people don't believe that she'll ever actually see justice. It's just sort of a way to cause the public to believe that something has happened. I think many people feel that Ghislaine Maxwell might suddenly have an urge to commit suicide.
Or while in jail, she might be threatened with an infection from Hep C, right? Remember George Floyd.
Or COVID. Yeah.
Right. George Floyd was infected with COVID. But let's back up, because you ask, is there a link between the raid on StarNet and what we've previously been talking about? Absolutely. That was a preemptive raid because, very interestingly, it involved 100 law enforcement officers. That's a huge number, including the Vancouver Police, RCMP, that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the high-tech squad from Ottawa, and 2 SWAT teams. And I'm a Canadian citizen, and I'm objecting strongly because there were 2 SWAT teams from south of the border, the IRS and United States Customs Service. And
now, why would the IRS be involved? We've never really had a good explanation as to why the IRS, a U.S. really, tax enforcement organization, what are they doing in Vancouver? And no one was ever charged. No one has gone to jail over this. You've told us many times how the equipment has disappeared. We've speculated about the concept of perhaps a similar system being installed on Jeffrey Epstein's 727. And that's not just pie in the sky guess. It seems logical that if you were to create a business that involved illegal actions, rape, torture, child pornography, or whatever, having a way to dispose of witnesses or victims would be key to avoiding arrest. So in the case of StarNet Communications, we've spoken a lot about how victims were brought allegedly to the pig farm where they were ground up and eaten by pigs. We've also spoken about how Jeffrey Epstein's use of a 50-year-old 727 doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense unless we consider the unique feature of the 727 having that Cooper, what's his name, David? D.B. Cooper had escaped out of the rear compartment of the plane. The 727 has this very unique feature where it can open a door in flight that people or items could be dropped or forced out of. So it does seem that disposing of victims, disposing of witnesses is a key factor here.
Well, absolutely. You see, so what I believe, coming back to Oliver Buck Revell, I think he equipped the StarNet people with the means to record the faces of people attending studio sessions perhaps out at the pig farm or at 425 Carroll Street, involving the production of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming, which I have reason to believe involves Deadpool gaming, which is the D in my BIDMAP acronym. But I'll come back to that. So with Images Technologies at 1075 Georgia Street, which interestingly enough was a group of offices where I worked for a while in the late 1990s. So for all I know, Oliver Buck Revell was running a protection racket from the same offices where I was working, but I didn't
It's
know it
quite
at the
bizarre.
time.
It's very
And
close to 425 Carroll Street.
Oh, it is. But now, just going back to what he did, he comes out of the FBI at a very senior level, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, having walked onto the tarmac and taking his son and daughter-in-law off the Pan Am 103 boarding before it was blown up over Lockerbie. He must have known. You wouldn't do that. It's such an odd thing to do, to take these two people off the tarmac, and then it was blown up over Lockerbie. All right. Then he would have been involved in spoliating evidence needed for a successful prosecution or crime scene investigation, because he was in charge of that investigation. Just bringing back the link to the Weather Underground.
Let's stay on that for a second, David, because this is so important. This is one of these things that we've spoken about many times that people could dismiss as speculation, but it isn't. This goes back to a book that was written about the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. And Oliver Buck Revell sued David Hoffman, the author of the book, under the claim that he was acting with actual malice. This was a defamation claim, and actual malice is one of the elements of defamation that can result in someone losing a lawsuit, which could have resulted in the removal of the book, financial damages to the author. But actually, after an incredibly lengthy lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Oliver Buck Revell was unable to prove that the author was lying, which is fairly substantial evidence that the claims are accurate, that Oliver Buck Revell did remove his son and daughter-in-law from the plane in a very dramatic charge out onto the tarmac. It's such an obvious indicator of foreknowledge. It's suggestive that the FBI knew, or at least Oliver Buck Revell knew, that the plane would be destroyed before it took off.
That's interesting, because I hadn't picked up on the fact. You see, I believe what these people do is they frame you as slandering them or libeling them by saying Oliver Buck Revell acted with malice. He may not have acted with malice. He may have been negligent.
No. Oliver Buck Revell claimed that the author acted with malice by putting out a lie. And he was unable to prove that because he had no proof that the guy lied. It's an indication that he actually did run out on the tarmac and do this. I mean, I was trying to find the complaint and some of the pleadings in the court case, but it happened something like 20 years ago, so it's very difficult to find that material.
Okay, in the title, we talk about an FBI rogue, and we're talking about Oliver Buck Revell. So what we're saying is that Oliver Buck Revell is gone rogue on the FBI, at least the FBI that we understand to be looking after the interests of the American people in respect to crime. Right? So acting from within the FBI, he would have had an opportunity to see what kinds of technologies were available to the FBI to monitor or run surveillance on criminal groups. I mean, that's basically what his job was. So let's say he had found the technology being used by criminal organizations, right, such as the ones that intended to blow up planes, right, as part of a terrorist operation. Remember, Bernardine Dawn said, what is it, guard your planes?
Yes.
Guard your colleges.
Hospitals.
Right? And so what we have is the Weather Underground is ostensibly a terrorist organization committed to overthrow the government, etc., etc. But what happens if it's a fake organization set up by the Rhodes Scholars and N.M. Rothschild? Because I don't know if you remember that BIC in New York, which employed one Barack Hussein Obama to write articles on leveraged leases and currency swaps, right, is also alleged to have offered to fund the Students for a Democratic Society for demonstrations in Chicago.
Now let's talk
And
about that. How do we know that the BIC funded these demonstrations?
well, no, if you go to the Wikipedia entry with all its faults and look up the Business International Corporation, you'll find it is alleged by a delegate called the Kid at some conference in Chicago, I believe, that the BIC had offered to fund SDS demonstrations in Chicago.
I see
And of
that
course,
here. Let's read it.
right.
It says, in his book, The Strawberry Statement, former student protester James Coonan reports a description of Business International by an unnamed Students for Democratic Society conference attendee in 1968. The attendee, referred to by Coonan as the Kid, claimed the company offered to finance SDS demonstrations in Chicago. Business International is described as the left wing of the ruling class and as desiring a Gene McCarthy presidency. Now, wait a minute. Isn't this the guy who said everybody was a communist?
That I don't know.
Yes, he is. It's Eugene Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy. Why would they want him to be a president if they're into communists? But this is interesting, David, because this is an unknown person who's going by the Kid. So, we've spoken quite a lot about social engineers on our show and how they always seem to change their names because, you see, fake news today becomes history if it's unchallenged and it gets recorded and people refer to it in the future. I think it's part of the reason why some of the people who have brought lawsuits against me are doing what they do, because you can make allegations in a lawsuit that you can't make in other forums without being subject to defamation claims yourself. You've got unqualified immunity from defamation for statements made in a civil suit. So accusing someone of this or that in a court pleading versus a news article or an interview or something like that is something that people can do to put allegations into the public. Now, in the case of Oliver Buck Revell versus David Hoffman, Oliver Buck Revell, he's a very connected former FBI agent. He's a member of basically every police organization you could imagine. He's a highly regarded guy. I would imagine he's got quite an advantage over a journalist or an author in a legal case. And it's amazing to see the connection between these lawsuits back then and now. They seem to utilize some of the same techniques because I think in a general sense, if you bring a lawsuit against a journalist, there aren't too many journalists who are famously wealthy. It's generally a low-paying job, and a lawsuit that would hang somebody up for several dozen or even over $100,000, whether the allegations in it are true or false, it's generally sufficient to shut most people down.
And particularly if you have this face recognition software that allows you to operate a bid map tax extortion racket, where, remember, just to remind people, B is for bombing, I is for infection, D is for deadpooling. Now, a lot of people may not know what deadpooling is. It's where an organized crime group actually takes bets, or it doesn't have to be an organized crime group, on when someone will die. And it might be a time or a day based bet. So if on the internet or the dark web, you are told, if you don't do what you're told, we're going to open a book on Deadpool betting where people can bet on what time you die. Like, let's say, for all I know, George Floyd, right, was told, we want you to go to that store. Here's a $20 bill. 20 in Roman numerals is double X, double cross. All right. And get yourself arrested. And he turns out to be infected with COVID-19. And there's a backstory there because the guy who knelt on his neck and allegedly asphyxiated or killed him was Derek Chauvin, who was moonlighting as a cop at the same nightclub. So there's always a backstory here. So BidMap is bombing, infection, deadpooling. Now that might be really scary for anyone in the food chain, right up to the top. Let's say Boris Johnson is discreetly told, look, Boris, if you go ahead with cancelling the license fees for the BBC. We're going to put you onto a Deadpool operation where people are going to place bets on what day you die, which might have been a day when you were in St. Thomas's Hospital being administered by a subsidiary of Serco through Viapath, the pathology lab at St. Thomas's Hospital, where there would have been an opportunity to put Boris onto a ventilator where he might not have emerged. Now, I don't care how brave you are. If you look at the way people die with this upper respiratory disease, they drown in their own lung juice or so on. They choke, they suffer, they're terrified, etc. It doesn't matter who in the world believes in the theory of how COVID-19 is transmitted. It can be transmitted, presumably, by an asymptomatic carrier, such as George Floyd. So what I believe that Clinton did as a Rhodes scholar, or after being expelled from Oxford University, he comes back to Arkansas and he sponsors, SPONSORS, a dirty blood program, which can be used to infect people within the prison system or outside the prison system in Angola, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, with the transmission of some foul disease, including Ebola, where apparently you sweat blood. It's a hideous disease. And you are basically in a position to cull target populations of the people you don't like through the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme, funded
David,
by
let me,
Rothschild.
let me point to this, because here's an article that's touching on exactly what we're discussing that I don't know if we've seen this before. This is from the New York Times in 2002, talking about a new side to face recognition technology. I don't know if people knew that this was around for so long, but this is saying since September 11th, discussions of the disputed technology of face recognition has focused on its potential to identify criminals and terrorists. So here we can see another sort of benefit to these people of September 11th. It's ushered in a huge market for this technology. And I think you're going to find it interesting to note, David, that this is talking about Pete Spindler, detective and superintendent with the National Crime Squad, talking about how they've turned to Serco and Imagus technologies to enable this. Here we go. Serco turned to Imagus. What was the name of that thing? Phase 2 or something like that? Child base?
Child base.
But there was something else about face something. I'm having a difficult time finding that article.
Okay, let's just go back to this is very important. Child base was developed by Imagus Technologies, apparently in a joint venture with the National Crime Agency and Serco, right, to track pedophiles or suspected pedophiles. Now, consistent with this double cross operation, what I believe they can do from a technological point of view, courtesy, I believe, of Oliver Buck-Ravel and various ghost people from within the Rhodes Scholarship Organization, is they can take a hotel room, an image of a hotel room with particular pictures up on the wall, etc. They can book in an innocent party the day before using the Nortel government JABS system, Joint Automated Booking System, sold to the Department of Justice, celebrated at that DOJ Great Hall meeting in 1996. They can take an innocent party who they want to arrange to be suspected of pedophilia, right? Book them into a hotel room or track them into a hotel room and take pictures of them in the hotel room. The next day, they can take an actor dressed up or with makeup, can be man or woman, to look like the individual they want to create as a suspect for a pedophilia operation. They can take a child who's been abducted from the streets, right? Put the adult actor and the child together, and the child is raped, and a film is made, right? Then, using artificial reality and face recognition and some splicing technique, they can create what appears at first blush to look like a documentary of the individual they want suspected raping a child, right? Then they can put that out on the internet. And if you look up Operation ORE, O-R-E, and Operation Cathedral, you'll find two enormous roll-ups of alleged pedophile rings by a joint venture, apparently, between the FBI, and the National Crime Agency using the Serco and Oliver Buck-Revell's face recognition software. That resulted in thousands of arrests. And then they found out that many of those people arrested had had their credit cards stolen, possibly in the hotels, or their credit card numbers in the hotels, and that was used to download pornography. So 33 suicides, and I know we've talked about steganography, resulted. And I believe the families of the people who committed suicide, they have a claim, but I don't want to go into too much detail. There is so much wrong here because you've got rogue people, rogue G-men from within the FBI who are in a position to launch man-in-the-middle attacks on the command and control systems of the Five Eyes countries. And I believe in 1987, Oliver Buck-Revell would have pioneered the introduction of a backdoor into the Federal Bridge Certification Authority that would allow him to track people through face recognition software through various departments, including the Inland Revenue Agency, the IRS.
This is where it's sort of a nexus with a lot of what we've discussed, David, because there's a bunch of characters who have presented themselves throughout the 3 years that I've been doing Crowdsource the Truth and in the time that you and I have known each other, who seem very interested in what we discuss. And, you know, you've spoken about Jerome Lemelson's prisoner tracking patent. We know that the technology of GPS ankle bracelets exists. Used to have a guest on the show by the name of Michael Barden, who actually had one of these GPS tracking bracelets on, because according to Michael, he'd been wrongly accused of a felony gun charge. He claimed he never even had a gun in his hand, and that somebody else pointed a gun at him, and that he had been entrapped. And George Webb's brother, David Swigert, became very interested in this guy, Michael Barden. It didn't make a lot of sense to me, but he contacted this guy's lawyer during a time that Michael was trying to get himself out of a plea bargain that he felt he was forced to enter. And in part, it's possible that some of the activities that Mr. Swigert engaged in affected Mr. Barden's ability to eliminate this plea, and he now has a felony. So this presents a lot of challenges to Mr. Barden in terms of finding certain types of jobs, the ability to vote. He's demoralized, obviously, and perhaps it puts him in a position where he may have to do things that he otherwise might choose not to. Additionally, this Images Technologies facial recognition, it seems remarkably similar to things we've heard about Clearview AI and their facial recognition. Now, a person contacted me who knows George Webb, knows his brother David Swigert, and knows this guy Peter Duke. And this person alleged that Peter Duke had facial recognition software on his phone. In a phone conversation with Peter Duke, he admitted that to me and then very aggressively attempted to remove that video from YouTube. These various attacks on the YouTube channel, David, are a big reason why we've started these sponsor exclusive shows on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. By introducing this business model, David, where viewers subscribe to the show for as little as $2 a month, this throws a major monkey wrench into the plans that some of these social engineers have used, where they create false identities to flood a YouTube channel or to put out a lot of artificial reality messages using fake names, sock puppet accounts, and causing people to perceive a false reality. By introducing that small financial subscription model of $2, it really complicates putting in, say, 5,000 accounts, because they'd have to pay thousands of dollars to do that, where their traditional method allows them to do it virtually for free. And we don't necessarily have definitive evidence that links these people to the things that we're describing. We're speculating. And the fact that they've become so interested in you and in me, I mean, we didn't locate these people and start talking about them. We started talking about the Federal Bridge. You started talking about Nortel and their spinoff Entrust. You started talking about the Kinetic North America social engineering protection apparatus. And it's strange, just talking about all these things seem to have attracted people with a particular interest in them. What do you think about that?
Well, because we've got inside their command structure, right? And I believe 1987 was a pivotal year for backdooring the Five Eyes communication system or signals intelligence, because by then the maturity of the Federal Bridge or public key infrastructure was such that they could introduce it as a method of supporting, I believe, double cross operations. Now, 1987 was the year before 1988 got blown out of the skies, right? By then, I believe Oliver Buck Revell would have been a sophisticated user of tracking technology through the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, which is invented at GCHQ in the United Kingdom. Right? And GCHQ invented it, I believe, in the late 60s and early 70s. They immediately, as I understand it, shared the technology with the National Security Agency, of which today the former director in charge of signals intelligence at NSA, Maureen Baginski, she's now the vice president of national security at Serco.
Right.
So they've let Serco into the back door of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And Serco has a prisoner custody and escort service. So they've actually got prisoners embedded within the company that is, I believe, attempting to take down the United States of America and doing a wonderful job of it, because the American intelligence agents have got their heads where the sun doesn't shine. And I'm thinking particularly of something that was created in the Marine in 1987, which is the Marine Corps Intelligence Activities, founded by a man you spoke to some months ago, right?
Well, there's an allegation in the public sphere that Robert David Steele co-founded this Marine intelligence activity. I don't know that much about it, but when I spoke on the phone to the former Marine Commandant Alfred Gray, this guy is I think he's a 3-star general, and he was the head of the whole entire Marine Corps. When I asked him about this claim from Robert David Steele, Alfred Gray said it was ridiculous and incorrect.
Well, let me just jump in there. But if you look at the importance of the Marine Corps intelligence activity, it was introduced in 1987 by Albert Gray, I believe, the commander of the Marine Corps. And his key doctrine, if you will, was maneuverability, synchronized maneuverability. And he taught all the way from the Marine grunts up to the greatest level. Something that really struck me, I've just read about it, is that he would have brainstorming session where the individuals would remove their rank badges. That would allow a Marine Corps grunt, right, someone down in the trenches, to talk to a 1-star general, or whatever is the rank associated with it, and brainstorm how to improve maneuverability during warfare. Now, what concerns me greatly is to what extent Albert Gray, or was it Alfred Gray? Albert Gray? Or
Alfred, sorry, yeah, Alfred Gray.
Alfred Gray, to what extent inadvertently, I think this is a highly honorable, highly capable man, left a back door for Marine Corps people with a background to come in through that back door and launch a man-in-the-middle attack on the Marine Corps intelligence activity, which would be consistent with the extent or the failure of the Marine Corps intelligence activity or the Marine Corps diplomatic missions to defend the embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in 1998, which was on, that attack took place on my birthday, 7th of August, right, 1943. And very interestingly, it appears those attacks were synchronized with great precision.
Yeah.
Now, who has the clock or the timing signals that would allow the Marine Corps intelligence activity and other arms of the American command and control systems to synchronize their activity? There is only one, and that's this British company, Serco.
Right, who control the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, where the cesium fountain clock resides, correct?
And they also control the pedophile tracking system using the facial recognition software developed by Oliver Buck Revell, which I believe is part of what I've called a BIDMAP tax protection racket.
Now, David, we're almost out of time. And we're going to be getting into some more details about all of this, how Harvard University was the first location in the United States to be synchronized with Greenwich Mean Time, how this Oxford Rhodes Scholar Network seems to have delivered us a bunch of rogues. We're going to talk about the possible connections between Chesa Boudin, our friend Oliver Buck Revelle, the Weather Underground, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa. And we're going to get into all of that stuff in just about 10 minutes when we continue with the sponsor exclusive segment on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsource-the-truth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsource-the-truth. David, this is very relevant because this addition of tax, unfortunately, to our viewers on Patreon, it could be viewed as another weaponization of the IRS. It's obviously something that we didn't have to deal with before. And I do want to thank all of our generous sponsors who make this show possible. You're going to want to check with Patreon and your local state's sales tax to be sure of how this affects you. But David, anything you'd like to say briefly in closing before we transition over to the sponsor exclusive show?
Well, I'd just like to underline the menace that is presented to the survival, an existential threat to the Republic, if they have deployed infected prisoners, right, to spread this COVID virus around, and they can launch a tax attack on an individual or an audit and basically shut them down financially. Basically, it's a double whammy. And I believe Americans, if I may be impolite, need to wake up, smell the coffee, right? Because really, you've got a cyber Pearl Harbor underway right now before your very eyes.
Stunning, David. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Looking forward to seeing everybody over there on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thanks for watching, everybody, and a huge thanks to our generous sponsors who make this show possible. Even if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or Periscope, you should thank the sponsors of the show. We couldn't bring you this show without their support. David, I look forward to the next segment in just a few minutes.
Thank you, Jason.